Anybody here who is in my APA section who I haven't met yet? If so, if you wouldn't mind raising your hand, I'm just curious. I've got lots of people to meet. And also just acknowledging it's a tough time of the semester. Many of you are, knee deep in final papers, getting ready for final exams, and also thinking about your capstones and your advanced policy analyses. So just acknowledging this is a really intense time where there's a lot colliding, and just really appreciate your being here and clearing this space to think about qualitative research for next semester. So again, welcome, and I'll go ahead and get started. So I want to start with a claim to consider, and this claim is that not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. You will see throughout this presentation I have lots of nature imagery, and that is just because that is what I need today. And I hope it's something that brings you a sense of peace today as you're thinking about all of these things. So in terms of an agenda for today, I want to just give you a brief background on qualitative research methods. I know that many of you that are in the MPP program do cover qualitative research methods just very, very briefly in the foundations class with Mia. I know Meredith taught that to you all. And for the MPA students, I taught this to you briefly over the summer. And I know for some of the classes that I taught, it was a bit rushed, just based on what else we had going on. So for some of you, this might actually be review, but hopefully it'll just have a little more room to breathe and a little more room to kind of enter your consciousness now that you especially have your APA or your capstone top of mind. So I'll be covering who to interview and why to interview them. And throughout this conversation today, I'll be giving you some broader context of qualitative research methods generally, and I'll be really focusing in on what is most relevant in terms of the types of interviews you're likely to conduct for your work. So I'll be calling those background interviews. So within that context, thinking about preparing for these types of interviews, establishing rapport, asking good questions, and then analyzing your findings and adding them to your report. I just want to add that I will upload these slides to a centralized hub. So if you're somebody who's trying to figure out how many notes to take, just do please know that I will be uploading this deck shortly after the presentation to the Cecile, what's that hub called? I can't remember. It's a shared.
It's the B Courses Community Hub. And if you send me the slides, I can make sure it's included with the video.
Awesome. Thank you. Any questions about the agenda before I move forward, or anything else you want to make sure that I cover? Okay. So I just want to give you some background on qualitative research before I get into the details of the kind of qualitative research that you might likely be doing as part of your capstones or your APAs. So first, just kind of breaking apart these terms. What is research generally? So research is just the systematic application of a family of methods employed to provide trustworthy information about problems. This is very much the cornerstone of what we teach here at GSPP, and a cornerstone of, I hope, what attracted you to GSPP. So this idea of systematically applying methods to provide trustworthy information. So this, of course, applies to quantitative as well as qualitative research. But qualitative research is often, I think, people don't always think of it as being highly structured, but I really want to convince you today that it can and should be a structured approach to helping gather information that allows us to understand, theorize, or explain. And the idea here is that it can and should be organized and systematic. And qualitative research is just an umbrella term that covers an array of interpretive techniques that seek to describe, decode, translate, and otherwise come to terms with the meaning of what we see in the natural world. Some of the characteristics of qualitative research, I usually think about it as being inductive rather than deductive. So researchers gather data to formulate theories rather than testing hypotheses per se. That being said, you may find in the course of conducting interviews or background interviews, you will start to have theories and hypotheses in your mind, or even that you explicitly state that you are starting to test out in conversation. Another just general characteristic is often what you come away with are thick and rich descriptions. And the way, another just general characteristics of qualitative research is that it's thought of as emergent and flexible generally, and that description is a key component. I always like to show this idea of quantitative and qualitative research really complementing and informing each other. It's not a competition of what is better or superior, but rather how can these two different methodologies really complement each other. Just a little bit more background on qualitative research before I get into interviewing as a specific technique. So these are, again, just some ideas to consider about how qualitative and quantitative research differ. So certainly I'll just let you read these, but the focus, the philosophical roots, the goals, the design, the methods of collecting the data, all of these tend to be different between qualitative and quantitative research. I should add that if you're interested in really using qualitative research methods as your primary way of understanding what you're doing for your capstone or your APA, to really strongly advise you to take a deeper dive if you haven't already done so in qualitative research methods. I know that the timing is awkward, but I am teaching a qualitative research methods class next semester at Mills College that we have a sister relationship with, and you're allowed to take classes at Mills and they transfer to UC Berkeley seamlessly. However, it is in Oakland. So I'll give you more information after this conversation about the qualitative research methods class that I teach that you're all invited to take. It's a seminar style, it's small, and I have had at least one MPA student who did take that class at the same time that he was working on his capstone, and he felt that it served him really well. So just putting that out there in case you're somebody who thinks you want to use qualitative research as a primary methodology in your thesis and you haven't yet taken a qualitative research methods class. There's, today will really just be the tip of the iceberg in terms of what methods you might use for qualitative research. So just want to underscore these differences between qualitative and quantitative research. The sampling method that we describe the way that we gather data as being purposive, so intentional, as opposed to quantitative research, which is generally random. So there's not necessarily an attempt at randomizing a sample when we're doing qualitative research. The output for qualitative research is typically themes, so like general themes or frameworks. You might come out with recommendations for a survey. You might come up with a taxonomy, which would be just a type of framework or terminology or area potentially for further exploration. Whereas with quantitative research, typically you'll end up with descriptive statistics, numerical findings, results of tests. And I'll add that often when I read qualitative studies, the concluding thoughts in a qualitative study are often, these are the themes that we've identified in this research. it's hard to say if, these can be generalized beyond the scope of this case study. Additional quantitative research in the form of surveying would help strengthen our findings. Conversely, with quantitative research studies, often the final conclusion is these are just descriptive statistics, or these are just descriptions. We don't really know the why. We don't know how or why this is actually happening, and we recommend qualitative research as a means of further exploring these questions. Of course, the dream methodology is a mixed methodology, and I think this is really the emerging methodology within policy research, which is quantitative and qualitative research together, as we say, complementing. And the example that I would point to as really an exemplar of this would be Rucker Johnson's book, Children of the Dream, in which, he uses his rigorous econometric analyses coupled with rich, thick case studies, interviews, descriptions of individuals who lived the experiences that he's describing econometrically. So Children of the Dream, I would say, is like the dream methodology for us to aspire toward as researchers. And with our capstones and our APAs, we're probably lucky if we just get to do a tiny slice akin to the work that we might see in an exemplar like that. So when we think about qualitative research, our goals are typically exploration, so identifying patterns, themes, hunches, potentially identifying initial models, and then potentially developing rich descriptions, conveying information with detail and specificity. And the goal is always interpretation, to try to make sense of what's going on. These are some of the steps in qualitative research. And I would argue, even as we're potentially following the Bardakian Eightfold Path tools of policy analysis methodology, in some ways, these steps are really applicable to whether or not qualitative research is your primary methodology. I think that this type of set of steps is likely to apply to your capstone or your APA. So developing your question, defining the problem, conducting a review of the literature, assembling some evidence, gathering data, also assembling some evidence. That's potentially your part of your methodology, preparing and organizing your data, distilling the data into themes, and then presenting the data in narrative or graphic form. Some of the methods most relevant to APA and capstone include, and I don't know that people always think about this as a qualitative method, but the idea of document review. Many of you end up with volumes of data that you're reviewing, sometimes case studies, sometimes thick, rich individual examples of administrative data, and that can get into data mining, which I'll be briefly touching on today. One-on-one interviews. Sometimes you will be conducting focus groups. I would say that is rare, quite time consuming. I've only seen it maybe 6 or 7 times in the 5 years that I've been teaching APA. Dan, feel free to use chat if you've seen your students use focus groups. But most often, what almost everybody will be doing is one-on-one interviews, and more specifically, what I'll describe as background interviews in the course of your APAs or capstones. I'm going to pause here and read chat and also open up the floor if anyone has any questions that you would like to share. Oh, sorry, Kat, I see you see what does emergent mean in this case from a while back. And Dan saying, oh, I think it means the interaction between quantitative and qualitative information gathering emerges as any given piece of analysis proceeds. I don't even remember the slide where I was using the word emergent, but okay, Kat, it seems like you're satisfied with the answer. Yes, Erica, I'll be sharing these slides after the meeting. Document review different from literature review. Thank you, Dan, so much for chiming in. Sometimes the documents are things like a manual, like a policies and procedures manual. Like maybe your job for your capstone is to look at the policies and procedures a school district uses or has in their written manual for hiring substitute teachers, and to look at how the policies and procedures diverge from what's actually happening in practice. And so your document review might include things like personnel files, manuals, and that would be different from a literature review, which would be looking at best practices. Does that help, Kat? Any other questions before I keep on moving? And also, I should have told you at the outset, we will be doing a little bit of breakout room time. So I just think that helps with engagement and helps thinking about, empowering you to think about what you already know, because chances are you know a lot more than you think you do about the methods that we're talking about today. So on that note, before I go into more discussion and into more depth on this idea of interviewing, I just want to start out with giving you the chance to talk amongst each other about, this doesn't require any prior research or knowledge. There's no homework that you would have need to have done to answer these questions collectively. But perhaps introducing yourself, since we're a mixed group of MPPs and MPAs, so maybe getting to know each other briefly, and then sharing what experience you've had with either interviewing or being interviewed for research. So not the kind of interview like a job interview, but rather potentially a research interview. If you've never had that experience, that's completely fine, but just want to ask you to share if you have, and then talk about what went well and what could have gone better in that encounter. So any questions about that before I put you in breakout rooms? Any questions about that? I'm going to add these questions to the chat. And by round robin, I just mean everybody takes a turn. Okay, so I've added the questions to the chat, and I will go ahead and put you into breakout rooms to discuss this together. Oh, I can't, Cecile. Sorry, I don't have that power.
Okay, I can do it. How many students per room do you want?
6.
Okay, 1 second.
Oh. Does anyone have any insights from your breakout rooms that you wanted to share back? Hi, Yolanda. I wanted to share. Oh, I see some hands. Henry, let's hear it. Hi, Henry.
Hi, how are you doing?
Great
Thanks
to see
for
you.
the session. Yeah. My question is, I've done semi-structured interviews,
Mhm.
but for unstructured interviews, I'm wondering how you're going to quantify or do a data analysis. Yeah, based on, because the person is just like talking randomly. There's no structure. So
That's a great question, Henry. I wish there was like a very clear answer, and I will give you some thoughts on that. I'll give you some thoughts on that. So thank you, Henry. Nita?
Yeah, one interesting thing that came up in our group was around how to deal with the distrust that might come out of an interview. So if someone is skeptical or is worried that you might, or their words might get twisted, I'm wondering if you have experience with that and tips on how to navigate this challenge.
Yes, that's another thing that I will flag that we'll be talking about, establishing rapport. Yes. Are there any other hands raised that I'm not seeing? I just want to note that I think it was Rashab in our breakout room. I think Rashab was saying, in some ways, for folks that are still identifying their capstones and their APAs, or even the process that you used to come to your capstone or APAs, many of you already did a type of background interview in that process. So for many of you, you were potentially reaching out to folks in your network, telling them what you were interested in, asking them if they had any questions that aligned with what your interests were. And then potentially you asked a whole lot of exploratory questions about what they may or may not have presented. Similar to if you might have been interviewed for a possible opportunity and they asked you if you had any questions. Those types of background seeking questions are very much within the vein of what I think you'll be up to as you conduct background interviews for your capstones or APAs. So I just say that to say that this may feel really foreign, but to say that for many of you, this is sort of a part of how you're naturally or already operating as you just see the world and move through the world and try to make sense of making decisions just as part of life. So just wanted to kind of add that potential insight. So you asked really good questions that I hope I'll be able to answer in the next 45 minutes or so as I move through some of these different topics. Thank you so much for your participation in the breakout rooms. Want to move into this question about who you might interview and why you might want to interview them. Again, giving you some basic qualitative research method background, but I'll be zeroing in on this idea of the type of background interview that you're likely to conduct, that probably all of you will be conducting, regardless of the role that qualitative research is playing in your final work. So these are just some types of purposive sampling that you might consider depending on the type of research that you're doing. So you might be interested in interviewing sort of a typical representation of the instance that you're thinking about. So in the substitute teacher example I gave, you just might want to interview somebody who exactly describes a very typical substitute teacher. You might be interested, another strategy could be unique. So perhaps someone who got the substitute teacher of the year award in California, if there is such a thing, would be one end of the spectrum. And then maybe somebody who is never called. It's the substitute teacher that nobody ever wants to call because of their poor performance in past classrooms. They're scattered and they don't show up on time. So those would be opposite ends of the spectrum that you might want to consider interviewing. Putting this in terms of, an organizational framework. If let's say you're trying to understand the substitute teacher shortage within a school district, on the one hand, you might interview a principal of the school on one end of the spectrum. On the other end, you might interview a student or a teacher or somebody that's really dealing with this issue on the front lines. That also kind of gets at maximum variation, which has a similar description of what I've just given you. It could be, a wide variety of individuals in terms of where they stand. Another strategy you might use is convenience. So it just may be you have an aunt who's a substitute teacher and it's convenient. Your aunt is your next door neighbor. And so that's where you're going to start because it's easy. You might do snowball or chain sampling. So maybe you've interviewed your aunt and you know that she's connected to other substitute teachers. So you ask your aunt if she knows anybody else who you could interview who is also a substitute teacher. Similarly, let's say I had a student I'll be using this example today. I had a student who was looking at land use in the Sacramento Delta and potentially moving land from farm land use into conservation easements or land that would be conserved. And so every time she interviewed a farmer about their perspectives on land conservation, she would ask the farmer if they could recommend who she should interview next. And usually that led to additional referrals for subsequent interviews. So that snowball or chain sampling. Two-tier sampling just means you're trying to draw from two very different categories of folks. So in my own research, I was looking at reasons why people considered adopting children in foster care but dropped out of the process. And so the two tiers that I used in my sampling methodology were folks who dropped out was one tier, and then I also had kind of the other end of the spectrum, which would be folks who went on to adopt children in foster care. So those would be my two different tiers. So how many in a sample? It really depends. One way to figure this out is if you've reached saturation, so you're encountering the same themes repeatedly, you're not really gaining new information from your interviewing. That would be a way to know that you've sampled as many as you need to or want to. At the outset of your research, you can offer a tentative or approximate number based on your resources, such as time and money, for conducting these interviews. For the purposes of your work next semester, unless interviewing is your primary methodology, I think most people end up conducting somewhere in the ballpark of around 10 interviews. Often those are background interviews. So that might mean that interviewing is not your primary methodology. It's just part of how you're obtaining background information. And along the way, I think that generally somewhere in that ballpark is typical. And that could include everything from a classmate to your boss, to a few people that your boss recommends that you talk to another professor who's an expert on the topic that you're considering. These are types of interviews. Again, just wanting to give you this vocabulary just for you to know about types of interviews that you might conduct. So, on the one end is a highly structured, standardized type of interview. And in this scenario, your question order is predetermined. You could almost think of this as an oral form of a written survey. On the other sort of middling end of the spectrum is semi-structured. I think this is the method that is most commonly used for the type of research you would be conducting for capstones or APAs. This includes both structured and open-ended questions. And in this type of a scenario, the order of the questions is flexible. And then on the other end of the spectrum is a totally unstructured or informal conversation. And here it's really highly exploratory. It's more like a conversation. And this might take place with somebody you already know, or if you're just really beginning to get your feet wet on a topic before perhaps you've identified your interview guide. So usually we'll be doing semi-structured interviews, so that middle ground. I really like the analogy that you see in this picture where there's a path and there are guardrails, but you don't know where you'll end up. Because if you knew where you were going to end up, you wouldn't need to conduct the interview. So I really like this metaphor of a guided walk in which you have both structured and open-ended questions, and there's a flexibility to your approach. Some of the determinants of your questions might be what's the puzzle you're trying to resolve, trying to think about what will give substance to your eventual report, and that can help you develop your interview guide potentially. So this brings us to the idea of an interview guide and how to create your questions, which is really the crux of what I'll be talking about today. And some people call this an interview protocol. The word protocol is a little confusing because to me, the word protocol also means like are you sitting in a chair, or are you recording, or what's the methodology that you're using? But within qualitative research language speak, your interview protocol is usually the term used for your guide, your interview guide. So the set of questions that you're likely to ask in the course of an interview. So I do recommend devising this for the types of interviews that you're likely to conduct, which again, I'm describing as background interviews in the course of conducting your research. So this is generally a listing of areas to be covered in the interview. It can include a list of topics or questions for each subject. You could think of a guide as sort of like your cheat sheet, or like if you're an actor on a stage and you don't have all your lines memorized yet, it's just like your prompts to help you remember what you wanted to talk about. Usually you'll have 4 or 6 broad topic areas. You don't necessarily have to make sure the person answers every single question on your guide, but at least you've thought about it ahead of time, and you're prepared if you get stuck to refer back to those notes. I recommend starting neutral, starting potentially descriptive, and then moving on to opinion or controversy. And I also recommend ending with demographic questions if you need those for your research. This is just an example. I don't know if you can see it. It's a little small, but an example of an interview protocol for a structured interview. This researcher was looking at the patient experience in hospitals. This would probably be an example of a student using qualitative research methods as their primary means of obtaining data for their research. And I would describe this as more of a structured type of guide. But some of the features for you to notice are there are 4 broad areas, and there are specific questions written out that are bulleted, easy for the reader to scan and consider in the course of conducting the interview. Some things to think about in terms of asking good questions. So it's a good question if it's yielding descriptive data, even stories about the phenomenon. Piloting your questions can help you arrive at these good questions. And making sure that your questions are clear to your respondents. In our breakout room, Erica talked about making sure that you're using words that people understand, so avoiding technical jargon. These are just some features of asking good questions. I want to pause and just give you the chance to popcorn, maybe using the chat, maybe shouting out additional thoughts you have on asking good questions. That being said, I'll be talking a whole lot more about asking questions in the subsequent slides. So just give you a minute to popcorn. What are your thoughts on asking good questions? Curly is saying open-ended. Thanks, Curly. Being comfortable with silence, allowing silence after a question is posed. I'm so glad you said that. I had a tip from a journalist where in his own notes, he would ask the question, and then his note to himself was shut up, for himself to shut up. So to ask the question and then be silent. Thank you, Kat. That's really helpful. Mark is saying, I've often found follow-ups or probing questions. Can you say more about that? Can lead to the most interesting responses, allowing folks to share things they may have been holding back. Absolutely. Thank you, Mark. Yes, these are great starts. So thank you for that. So thinking about this interview encounter, these days, so many of our interviews will be conducted over Zoom just because of COVID. And there are so many blessings to that. There are also limitations to that. But when we think about establishing rapport, we might think about that within the Zoom context. So as we think about establishing rapport, this idea of being respectful, non-judgmental, non-threatening is just a beginning. Communicating that your respondent is the expert and letting that be known early on. just remembering, I think a lot of times when I'm going into an interview, depending on the context, I feel nervous. But remembering that your respondent, no matter who they are, even if they're Rucker Johnson, they might be feeling nervous too. Most likely they are feeling nervous. And so trying to put them at ease is really helpful. And again, reminding them that they're the expert, or appreciating their expertise right from the outset can be a helpful way of establishing rapport. I would love additional just popcorning, either shouting out or using the chat, in terms of if you have any tips and tricks for establishing rapport. It could be within the context of meeting your friends' children for the first time. Like, what are your tips and tricks? Of course, talking to children is a whole other I guess, art. So maybe we don't want to get too derailed there, but just when you're meeting somebody for the first time, having a conversation in which there will be a type of inquiry. What are your tips and tricks for establishing rapport? Ask questions to show you're interested in the person you're interviewing. I love it, Yolanda. That's great. Erica saying, letting the interviewee know why you selected them for the interview can break the ice. That's so good, Erica. That's such a good point. Yes, I love it. Kat, when I was co-facilitating a focus group with a youth group, we created community agreements. I love it. And the youth were able to clarify terms that they don't like don't call us kids. Yeah, Kat, thank you so much. That's a great one. Yes. So certainly for focus groups, establishing community agreements can be a helpful point of departure. Body language to help them relax. Nita, thank you. Gratitude for their time and participation. Tamara, thank you. These are great. You can feel free to keep them coming. Letting them know you believe their knowledge and experience are important. Absolutely. So when you begin the interview, generally I recommend describing your motives and your intentions. So the purpose of the study, like what you're up to and why their perspective is important to you. If you're able to protect their identity, letting them know that from the outset, that potentially you'll be using pseudonyms if applicable. Some researchers like the idea of letting the respondent pick their own pseudonym. Often for the types of interviews you're conducting for APAs or capstones, if you're doing these background interviews, often you are talking to respondents who are on the record and will be named. But it can be really helpful to clarify right from the outset if the interview is going to be on the record, if they will be named, or if part of your strategy is to anonymize your respondents, perhaps, so that they open up more, share more, are more willing to give you perhaps information that they wouldn't otherwise give were it not anonymized. Being clear about who has final say over the content. For example, are you willing to share a summary or the findings of your interview? Are you willing to share a draft report in which you're quoting them and give them the chance to strike something or revise what they've said? And I'm not saying you have to do that, but to think about it ahead of time, if that's something you're willing to offer the respondent, it can create a whole lot more work for yourself. So I don't necessarily recommend it, but you can just consider if that's something you're able to offer. And if so, just making those terms explicit. It can be helpful to, right from the get-go, telling the respondent how long the interview is likely to take, whether there will be a follow-up interview. Of course, if you're being recorded, letting them know or asking their permission to record. And if they do give permission to record, asking their consent for the recording. Yolanda saying, if you're interviewing someone who is knowledgeable on a topic, if you've done your homework, you can let them know what you've learned based on their knowledge. Love it, Yolanda, thank you. So moving into types of questions that you might ask. So these are just some of the broad categories. So engagement questions, introducing participants to make them feel comfortable with the topic of discussion, exploration questions that really get to the heart of the discussion, and then some kind of summation questions. So things like, of all the things we talked about, what do you think is the most important? So those are called like all things considered questions. And then finally, exit questions. So checking to see if anything was missed in the discussion. These are some examples of policy specific prompts. So things like, what's the real problem? So these are like root cause questions. What are some viable solutions, policies, alternatives? These types of questions could become the heart of your report. So really thinking about, again, for these background questions, these background interviews, thinking about, if you have access to somebody who really has expertise in your area that you're exploring, these interviews can actually form almost like the outline of your report. So questions like this, what might these policies lead to? What are the criteria that matter most to the client? Again, these can form the basis for your report. These were some of the pieces of advice you were already giving each other. So questions should be short and to the point, focused on one dimension each. They should be worded unambiguously, generally open-ended. Sometimes you might use a sentence completion type of question. So something like, I am blanking on a sentence completion type question. I don't have one in my back pocket. If anybody has an example they want to throw in the chat, feel free. Maybe it would be, if you could use one word to describe your experience as a substitute teacher, what would that be? Not exactly a sentence completion type, but a sort of more closed-ended type of question. Questions should be non-threatening. They should be worded, if you're intending to get a more sort of full-fledged answer, they should be worded in a way that they can't be answered with a simple yes or no. So instead describing how. These are some examples of probes to get more information. So what else can you say about that? Can you give me an example? Is there anything you can add? How important is this? Can you tell me how you felt about this thing? These are some more probes. I want to make sure I understand. Can you explain more? Can you give me an example? What's the best way to summarize your point for the notes? What do you mean when you say such and such thing? These are some examples of close-ended questions that can just be helpful and that are not sort of wrong to include. So sometimes having a combination of closed and open-ended questions in the course of an interview can just break up the flow and make things more interesting. Questions to avoid, leading questions, closed-ended questions when what you actually want is a narrative response, double-barreled questions. A lot of people recommend against asking why, just simply why, because it has a hard edge and can make a person feel potentially threatened. Perhaps instead saying, can you tell me more about that? Or can you share why you could maybe find a way to get why in there, or can you say more? Can you explain that in different words, but avoiding the just simple flat out why would be a recommendation. I do really recommend including these questions. So ending your interviews with, is there anything else you'd like to share? Are there additional questions you'd suggest I include in future interviews? And then if you're doing snowball sampling, who else do you think I should interview? And a variation on that could be something like, let's say you've interviewed a substitute teacher who loves his job and just has nothing but positive things to say about their substitute teaching experience. You could ask, I've noticed you you love your job. I'm interested in interviewing somebody who has a really different perspective from you. Can you recommend somebody who might offer a counter opinion or a counter perspective? And Kat is asking, are there resources you recommend or ethics techniques for interviewing folks who've experienced trauma? Kat, I'll be really happy to follow up with you on that one-on-one. Yes, Tamara, is there a question you wish you thought I have asked but didn't? Yes. I just to come back to Kat's question, everything I've given you, the details that I've given you, again, are primarily directed around background interviews, sort of the generic type of interview that you're likely to do for your APA or Capstone. If you're interviewing folks who have experienced trauma, I would put that in a different realm of qualitative research that I would recommend a lot more training in conversation and research about. And I'm happy to follow up with you on that, Kat. Hi, Annie. Nice to see you. Great. So I think we have, let's see, I think we have another 15 minutes to go, just as a frame of reference. And also want to give you the chance to do some more sort of thinking work and thought work and participating in this process. So that is coming up in my next slide. Just wanted to say a little bit about recording. So I do recommend recording if it doesn't inhibit what is being shared too much. Oftentimes recording it's another tool for you, whether or not you're planning to transcribe. It just can really free you up so that you're not having to take copious notes during the course of an interview. Just to know that you have that recording to go back and refer to, especially if you want to directly quote somebody and you want to make sure you're being faithful to what they have said. Transcription can be expensive. So something you can consider is in your notes, if somebody says something that, okay, let's just take it, pretend you're on Zoom and you're recording on Zoom. You're going to get that automatic transcript generated. That's awesome. Or let's say you're using your phone and you are creating a voice memo from the interview encounter. Again, underscoring, of course, you need consent. So do get that consent recorded. Do you consent to, I would like to interview you. This will enable me to really focus in on what you're saying and not feel that I have to write everything down. Do you give consent for this recording to take place? Agree on the terms of the confidentiality. And then just a tip for you that I really like is, let's just say you don't have the resources to transcribe and you're not planning to transcribe. You can just make a note to yourself at 10 minutes into this interview. So you can just, the note can be 10 minutes. My respondent said something that I want to make sure I go back and get the direct quote. So you can always go back and rely on it that way. It can really free up the listener again to listen instead of intently note-taking. Any questions, observations, or anything else folks want to add about recording? I think with Zoom, it's become so much more normalized. And so that's just a silver lining of the pandemic. Great. So I want to give you another chance to kind of think collaboratively and collectively about some of the things I've been talking about. And so there's two parts to this Google Doc, and I'll just invite you to share at whatever part kind of is speaking to you right now. So I'm just going to click on it myself. And give you a chance. I just added the link in the chat, so feel free to add to that. And the two parts here are, what ideas do you have for how to address power imbalances when conducting interviews? How can we do no harm? And when I say power imbalances, it may be that, you feel like I'm just a student and I feel shy and uncomfortable and I'm interviewing Rucker Johnson and I'm scared that he's such an expert and I'm just going to look like an idiot. So that could be part of what you mean by what I mean by power imbalance. It could be that you're interviewing a substitute teacher and you are a master's student at UC Berkeley, and they might be on the other side of that equation feeling like, I am a substitute teacher. I don't feel respected in our society. And this person is a, highly successful master's degree obtainer. And I feel shy about sharing my views. So what advice do you have in that type of a power imbalance? How can we do no harm when we conduct interviews, perhaps to ourselves as well as to our respondents? So I just find so often you have so much collective wisdom. So just really want to invite you to go ahead and share in this collaborative document your suggestions for doing no harm. So that's part one. And part two is, what ideas can you share with your peers about good questions to ask in background interviews? And ideas you have for actual probes that you might use to ask in a background interview. So just based on how long I've had this up and how many people I see in here, I'm just going to give you 3 minutes to work on this, recognizing that some of you might be eating lunch, you might be on the go and just not in a position to write. But for those of you, anonymous elephants and kind snake, anonymous squirrel, would love for you to just add thank you, Tamara, for kicking us off. Anonymous fox, welcome to the document. Thank you so much for those of you that are making contributions, and I'll just be quiet for 3 minutes to let you contribute. Mm. I love it. Thank you so much. I hope you feel safe to continue to share your fantastic ideas. And I just want to add, I usually start the semester this way. And when we're all doing it together in a within our Capstone or APA seminar, I just find there's so much collective wisdom in the room that I almost don't even need to teach anything about how to do interviews, because collectively you know so much and you're able to share so much. So oftentimes I think that these collaborative learning documents about how to conduct interviews, how to do no harm, how to address power imbalances. I think oftentimes within a seminar room of 12 people, you know as much as, as a single expert, and collectively you're able to share and teach each other the skills to do this effectively and well. So thank you so much for the contributions. I'm loving the points that I'm seeing made so far. I'm just going to continue on with my remaining slides, but I do invite you to continue to contribute if you have more that you want to share. Does anybody want to say anything about what you're seeing, or anyone want to just chime in verbally? Kat, I see you.
Hey, I'm sorry, did I miss it, or did you also mention resources for like pre-existing ideas on best practices with do no harm and things like that?
I didn't. And I have a folder of resources for qualitative research, including that will help you with that idea of doing no harm. So you didn't miss it. However, I do have this brief, very, big overview, big sort of meta perspective on that, Kat. So this idea of, when we think about doing no harm, part of that has to do with the interaction between the interviewer and the respondent. There are quite a few different sort of theoretical perspectives to think about that. So critical theory, race theory, feminist theory, critical race theory, queer theory, postmodernism have all been used as lenses to analyze the interview encounter. And whichever of these theories we're using to consider the interview encounter, ultimately the kind of meta questions are: who's controlling the direction of the interview, who's controlling the results, who's benefiting, who is telling the story, whose story is being told. So much of this has to do with power, privilege, these questions that are really at the core of our thinking and so much of our methodology. So, in the course of this brief conversation, obviously we can't go into great detail on this, but I am more than happy, Kat. I love the questions you're asking, and I think for all of us really to have our eyes on these, on this idea of doing no harm and thinking about power and privilege in interviews is a really important start to doing no harm. With that, I'm going to transition really dramatically to thinking about, once you've obtained this information, how you present it. And so once again, I'm going to start with kind of some general concepts for qualitative research, and then go into some details about, in particular, how you might incorporate background interviews into your APA. So with that, I just want to give you some ideas about qualitative data visualization for qualitative research. So I know from years of teaching and reading qualitative research that often what the output of qualitative research looks like, and what we often think about is this. So text, like walls and walls of text, right? And so I just really want to encourage you to, from the outset, especially if you're using qualitative research methods as your primary data gathering technique for your capstone or your APA, to just think about some really fun ways that you might display data. So just to give a fun and interesting example, this is an analysis of text exchanges at the beginning of relationships versus the end of relationships. And obviously this is, something that you might think about more from the standpoint of an ethnographic type of research, but you could easily, I should say, this technique that you're seeing here is called a word cloud. And it's a very common display mechanism for qualitative data research. And what happens is it's a software that is used that analyzes words that are more frequently used, and those appear bigger. And then the smaller are words that are less often used, but it enables you to quickly absorb themes within a topic. But I use this example because I think it can give you a really nice way of potentially imagining how you might structure two very different types of questions in the course of your interview that would yield this kind of fun data display. So an example could be, what were your feelings on day one of your master's program? How did you feel on the very first day? And then a second question could be, how do you imagine feeling on your very last day? I'm trying to think of examples that might be more perhaps capstone and APA relevant. So maybe I'll think about that example I already gave of my student who was working on land use in the Sacramento Delta. She might ask, when you think about the policies guiding land use in the Sacramento Delta, farmer, what words come to mind? So that could be one. And then a second question that would yield very different results could be, when you imagine the best, highest use of your land, what words come to mind? So the point is to create some kind of contrast that can create a really interesting visual display. Any questions about this? Here's just a fun one. Thousands of people have described their favorite teachers using only one word. Here are a few of them. This is using a picture. It's using a word cloud in a picture form that can just be a fun and interesting way to display your findings in your report. These are word bubbles where it's similar to a word cloud, except perhaps a little easier to read and digest, and it has some additional coding to make it easier to quickly interpret and understand the themes. So using green for positive, yellow or orange for negative, and they've used gray for neutral. And then the bigger or more prominent the finding is, the bigger the circle is. So that's just another way of displaying the data. I love this, and I see my students use this a lot, maybe because I teach it to them. The idea of using both closed and open and displaying them both together. So here you can see survey results and then examples, qualitative examples. So you could imagine a question, if your organization worked with an external evaluator, what was your experience? And then in the survey, they're given options: excellent, good, mixed, or poor, or horrible. And then perhaps the follow-up question is, what do you think why do you think the experience was or wasn't positive? So here you're getting some thicker, richer quotes that you can pull in that illustrate these sort of binary choices. So that's another way of displaying data that can be interesting and fun for your reports. I've never seen anyone do this, but I'm just putting it out there. You could, in the case that people are on the record and you're doing these background, potentially expert interviews. And when I say expert, I don't mean to say like Rucker Johnson is an expert and a program participant who is accessing food stamps is not an expert, because both are different types of experts. But you could just imagine perhaps folks in the first category might be more comfortable being on the record with their picture or, their title, next to what they're saying. So this is just another strategy to kind of bring to life the perspectives of your respondents. Just very briefly, want to acknowledge the fact that for those of you who are using qualitative research as your primary strategy, that you can conduct data analysis. Something I wish I'd said at the outset is if qualitative research methods are your primary means of, if it's your primary methodology, I cannot emphasize enough to you, qualitative research is very, very time consuming. So to collect enough data that it would actually warrant the use of qualitative data analysis software, probably you would be either getting started now, or you could be in a situation where the qualitative research has already been conducted. I had a student who, when she started this semester, she had data from 8 different focus groups that had already been conducted, and her job was to analyze those focus group findings as part of her research. It would not have been feasible within the course of the semester for her to organize and conduct those focus groups and analyze the data. I don't think it's very feasible. I mean, you can argue with me about this, and I would be happy to be proven wrong, but I just think it's a much bigger task than is possible to do in the course of a semester, to do end-to-end research that would warrant the use of qualitative data analytics software. That being said, every semester I maybe have one student in my groups who does use it. So I just wanted to let you know that it exists and just tell you a little bit about what it can do, and also to let you know that the D-Lab, I think, is that the right word? I want to say D-Lab, that might not be the right word. There is a lab at Berkeley that is free to you, in which, whether you're using qualitative data analytic software, whether you're using R or Stata, that can help you use these tools. If anyone can use the chat to correct me if D-Lab isn't the right word, but just to let you know, there are resources out there to help you do this. In terms of using qualitative data analytics software, my favorite is Deduce. And just very briefly, what this does is you have your qualitative data. Maybe it's case notes, maybe it's administrative data that already exists, maybe it's your interviews, and you identify themes within your qualitative data, and then you're essentially tagging, which means you're highlighting and putting a word that you're associating with that portion of your output. And then you can do analyses based on potentially demographics or all the themes together. And so just want to let you know this software exists. If you are potentially working with a large amount of data, you might want to use software. At the same time, I just want to emphasize it's rarely the case that you will need to do it. But if you do, I'm happy to meet with you one-on-one to share more about that. This is just another example of a type of output that can be helpful if you're using qualitative data analytics software. This is a type of report that shows the co-occurrence of themes, using an example from some research I did on children and families in foster care. But I want to switch gears and just show you a little bit about how you might incorporate interviews into your reports. So this involves, again, telling your story qualitatively, incorporating real stories about people or events potentially into your report. This can take the form of quotes, it can take the form of narratives, pictures, and just acknowledging that often this type of data can be more persuasive than facts and figures. I mean, ideally it's both and, right? But just hopefully you've got an and in there, that you're also incorporating qualitative data into your work. So the idea here is appealing to the heart as well as the mind as you're telling your story. So a few different approaches to how you might incorporate interviews into your report. They can serve as the background that informs your approach. And in this case, you might not be using direct quotes at all. I have seen APAs where in the methodology section, the writer says, to conduct this APA, I conducted 15 interviews from everybody ranging from, directors to managers to frontline workers throughout California. And there were no direct quotes given throughout the report, and that is okay. So just to say that that's the point of a background interview, like it could be very integral to your thinking, but yet you don't feel the need to surface what any one individual said. So that can be one model and one approach that I want to acknowledge as effective. Another approach could be sort of sprinkling these expert perspectives to further back up an idea. And that's where you might be using quotes, perhaps incorporating those into your report. Regardless of which method you use, remember to include this in your methodology section. The fact that you did conduct these interviews, that is part of your methodology. And to consider in your appendix, if you're able to actually name the people that you interviewed, that can further strengthen sort of the integrity, the validity, the transparency of the report that you've produced. So I'm giving you another example. I should have mentioned, so this is the same report that I've already mentioned from a student I had named Mia, who was describing, again, land use in the Sacramento Delta. And this is her table of contents. And just here's an example of how she kind of sprinkled these quotes into her findings. So here the headline is landowners face high cost of restoration and conservation projects. She makes a few statements about, the high costs of permitting, and then she backs that up with what a particular farmer said. An individual from a Delta community expressed this frustration, saying farmers are already too busy dealing with multiple regulatory and environmental issues and the associated paperwork, pesticide use, permits, state and federal Endangered Species Act issues, invasive species, etc. So that is how she integrated her interview into her report. Not rocket science, but I think it can be helpful just to see an example. That actually brings me to the end of what I wanted to share with you today. I have plenty of time for questions if you have them. Some of the key takeaways that I hope you take from today. The first is you got this, like you have this, you probably have, you've experienced, you have done this, whether you know it or not. So just to tap into that confidence and skill that you probably have already. And at the same time, want to give you some tools for how to be perhaps more systematic in approaching this. Acknowledging that interviewing can be, and I hope it really is, a key component of your work next semester. Another key takeaway is this idea of developing your interview guide ahead of time. Feel free to pull liberally from this presentation in terms of the actual questions that you're more than welcome to cut and paste and use in your interview guides. Ending an interview with, is there anyone else you recommend I contact? And then finally, knowing when to stop, knowing when you've gained enough information, when you've reached saturation, or just knowing when, if this happens a lot 3/4 of the way through the semester, you have 10 more people you could talk to, but you are one person you're probably not being paid enough to conduct, that 10th interview. So knowing when you've gained enough to actually write your report, and to know that you've done enough. So with that, I thank you so much for sticking with this, and happy to take any questions that you might have. I know a lot of people have to run. I know this is just such a busy time. So thank you again. Kat, hey, I see your raised hand.
Hey, sorry, I'm asking a lot of questions.
No worries.
Erica, have you ever run into a situation where the interview really doesn't give you much information and you feel like it should end more quickly than you anticipated? Is there a way to end it like delicately or anything?
I have had that exact experience. And I think it's just a question of just being polite. You might, if you told the person that the interview would take 45 minutes and you're 5 minutes in and you can see that you're not going to gain much more, depending on kind of the politics of the situation, I would actually encourage you just to continue the conversation for another 15 or 20 minutes, unless there's something harmful happening, just for the sake of politeness.
Thank you for everything.
Of course, Kat, and I'm really happy to follow up with more resources for you, and would love to hear about the kind of research you're thinking about conducting. All right, take care. Hey, Yolanda.
Oh, hi, Erica. I have a question. When you say develop your interview guide ahead of time, like how far into the process? I mean, it's not going to be like the first week, clearly, and then we have a whole semester, but how soon, like I know we'll be thinking about our questions, but will we be like exploring that in class and running through kind of?
Yeah, I think it just depends on whose class you have, but I think that type of guide will depend a lot on the purpose of your interviews, but I think jotting down notes at a minimum for before you're doing the interview will help you a lot. So just like spending some time thinking ahead about what you really hope to get out of it, even if you're not able to write like the very particular questions that you'll be asking.
Okay, great. Thank you. And this was great. And you're going to be posting this.
Yes.
Okay, I missed a couple things and I didn't want to stop you and ask you to go back. So I'll just look at it straight through. And
so nice to see you,
okay,
Yolanda.
Thank you. Okay, you too. Take care. Bye, everyone.
Bye, Yolanda.